My golden brother's fiancée gossiped about me behind my back, and my family humiliated me by choosing her over me. Now, years later, I'm wealthy while they're all apologizing and begging for just a drop of my money. Sup Reddit. I'm 26 years old now, and what I'm about to tell you happened a few years back when I was 23. Even though some time has passed, there are still nights when this whole situation keeps me awake, replaying everything in my mind. After seeing similar stories shared online, I figured that maybe sharing my experience might help someone else who's going through something similar, or at least let people know they're not alone when family turns against them. The whole mess started when I was 23 years old. My younger brother Blake was 21 at the time, and we had both ended up working at this mid-sized marketing company called Apex Marketing Solutions. We managed to get jobs there after we graduated from college. It wasn't exactly something we had planned, working at the same company as my brother, but the job market was absolutely terrible at the time, and they happened to be hiring when we were both desperately looking for work. I think it's important to give you some context about the relationship between Blake and me, because it plays a huge role in how everything unfolded. We never really got along growing up, and I don't mean we had the typical sibling rivalry that most brothers experience. We didn't hate each other or anything dramatic like that, but we were just fundamentally different people with completely different approaches to life. Blake was always what you'd call the golden child in my parents' eyes. You know those families where one kid could literally burn the house down and somehow it would end up being the neighbor's fault? That was Blake's position in our family dynamics. So anyway, there we were, both working at this company and trying our best to stay out of each other's way. For the most part, it was actually working out fine. We were in different departments, had different schedules, and managed to maintain a professional relationship without too much personal drama. Everything was going smoothly until Blake started dating this girl from the HR department. Her name was Victoria, and she was 22 years old at the time. She was exactly the type of girl that Blake always seemed to go for. Attractive, outgoing, and someone who seemed to be well-liked by everyone in the office. At first, I barely interacted with her beyond the usual workplace pleasantries. You know, the typical, "Hey Dylan, how's your day going?" Followed by my standard "good thanks" response. Just basic, professional small talk that you'd have with any coworker. She seemed nice enough from what I could tell, and honestly, I was happy for Blake. The guy had finally found someone who wasn't completely insane, which was a refreshing change from his track record. His history with girlfriends back in college had been pretty rough. A series of dramatic relationships that usually ended with some kind of chaos or emotional meltdown. But after they had been dating for maybe 6 weeks, I started noticing some weird stuff happening. Nothing major at first. Just little things that made me feel increasingly uncomfortable and started setting off alarm bells in my head. At the time, I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid or reading too much into innocent interactions. But looking back now, I should have trusted my instincts from the very beginning. Like during our monthly all-hands meetings, which were these company-wide gatherings where management would update everyone on quarterly results and upcoming projects. I started catching Victoria staring at me during these meetings, and I'm not talking about quick glances or accidental eye contact that happens when you're in a room full of people. These were full-on, prolonged stares that would last way too long and made me feel like I was being studied or analyzed. When I would finally notice and look back at her, she would immediately smile and look away, but it was happening far too often to be coincidental. There was something deliberate and calculated about it that made my skin crawl. Then there were the break room encounters that started becoming more and more frequent. Our office had this small kitchen area with a coffee machine, microwave, and a few tables. Basically the social hub of the company where people would grab their morning coffee, heat up their lunch, and chat with coworkers. It was completely normal workplace stuff, and I'd been using that space for coffee breaks since I started working there. But I began noticing that Victoria would always seem to show up whenever I was there, even if it was at odd times when most people were at their desks working. At first, she would make small talk about work-related topics, asking about projects I was working on, complaining about some HR policy, or mentioning something about a meeting we'd both attended. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, she started shifting these conversations toward more personal questions. She'd ask things like, "How do you like living downtown?" Or, "What gym do you go to?" Or, "Any fun plans this weekend?" These weren't necessarily inappropriate questions on their own, but combined with everything else, they felt like she was trying to gather information about my personal life and routines. The worst part, though, was the compliments she started giving me. She'd say things like, "You're so dedicated. I see you staying late all the time." Or, Blake is lucky to have such a hardworking brother. But the way she said these things felt loaded with some kind of underlying meaning that I was supposed to pick up on. There was this tone in her voice and this look in her eyes that made it clear she wasn't just being friendly or making casual conversation. It felt like she was testing the waters, seeing how I would respond to her attention. I tried my best to keep things professional and brief whenever these interactions happened. When she would ask personal questions, I would give short, non-committal answers and then quickly change the subject back to work-related topics. I figured that maybe she was just being friendly and trying to get to know her boyfriend's brother better, and that I was probably reading too much into the situation. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt and not create any unnecessary drama or tension in the workplace. But then the text messages started, and everything changed completely. It was a Wednesday night around 10:30 p.m., and I was at home doing what I usually did on weeknights, relaxing on my couch, watching some random show on Netflix, and eating leftover Chinese food from the container while catching up on emails. It was a completely normal, quiet evening, and I was just winding down from a long day at work. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message simply said, "Hey Dylan, it's Victoria. Got your number from the company directory. Hope that's okay." I stared at the message for a long minute, trying to process what I was seeing. Why would she be texting me at all, let alone at 10:30 p.m. on a Wednesday night? And why was she texting me from her personal phone instead of through work channels if this was something business-related? The company directory explanation was particularly weird to me. While HR definitely had access to everyone's contact information, using it for personal messages seemed like it was probably against company policy if not completely inappropriate. I decided to text back, "Hey, what's up?" thinking that maybe there was some kind of work emergency or urgent situation that needed to be addressed. Maybe someone had called in sick and they needed coverage, or there was some kind of system issue that required immediate attention. I was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt and assume there was a legitimate reason for the late-night contact. Her response came back almost immediately, which told me she had been sitting there waiting for me to reply. What she wrote made my blood run cold. "I've been wanting to tell you something for a while. I really like you. Like more than just friends. I know this is probably weird, but I had to say it. I had to." I literally said, "What the hell?" out loud to my empty apartment. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This woman was currently in a relationship with my brother, my own flesh and blood, and she was texting me at 10:30 p.m. to confess romantic feelings. What kind of person does something like that? What kind of person thinks that's even remotely acceptable behavior? I immediately typed back, "Victoria, you're in a relationship with my brother. How could you even say this to me?" I was trying to make it crystal clear that this was completely inappropriate and that I wanted nothing to do with whatever game she was playing. But instead of apologizing or backing down, she started this weird backtracking routine that wasn't really an apology at all. She responded with, "I know it's complicated, but I can't help how I feel. And maybe we could just grab coffee sometime to talk about it." She kept pushing the conversation like I was going to be flattered by her attention. Like I was supposed to be excited that she was basically asking me to help her cheat on my own brother. She seemed to genuinely believe that I would be interested in pursuing something with her, despite the fact that she was dating Blake, and despite the fact that this would destroy my family relationships. I shut that down as hard as I possibly could. I typed back, "No way, this conversation never happened. Don't text me about this again." She responded with a simple, "Okay," and that was the end of the exchange. At the time, I thought maybe she had finally gotten the message and would back off. I assumed she would keep things professional at work from now on, and we could all pretend this weird, inappropriate moment had never happened. I thought the worst was behind us, and that we could go back to normal workplace interactions. Man, was I completely wrong about that assumption. Looking back now, I should have immediately taken screenshots of those text messages. I should have told Blake right away what his girlfriend was doing behind his back. I should have reported her to HR for inappropriate contact and potential harassment. But I was trying to be the bigger person and not cause unnecessary drama or complications in the workplace and family dynamics. That decision to stay quiet and handle it privately turned out to be the biggest mistake of my entire life. Because just 2 days later, my whole world came crashing down around me in the most devastating way possible. So it's Friday afternoon and I'm at work, trying to focus on this quarterly report that was due Monday morning. It was one of those detailed analysis documents that required a lot of concentration and attention to detail. But I kept finding myself distracted and glancing over at the HR section of the office. I couldn't help but wonder if Victoria was going to try to approach me again, or if she had actually gotten the hint from my firm rejection 2 nights earlier. From what I could observe, she seemed to be keeping her distance and staying focused on her own work, which I interpreted as a good sign that maybe she had finally understood that I wasn't interested in whatever she was trying to start. Around 3:30 p.m., my phone started ringing, and I saw that it was my mom calling. This immediately struck me as odd because she never ever called me during work hours unless something was seriously wrong. I'm talking about genuine emergencies here. The only time I could remember her calling me at work before was when my grandfather had his stroke and they needed to rush him to the hospital. My parents were both very respectful of work boundaries and understood that I couldn't take personal calls during business hours unless it was truly urgent. "Dylan, you need to come over to the house right now," she said the moment I answered the phone. Her voice sounded all serious and strained, like she was barely holding herself together. There was this tone of controlled panic that I had never heard from her before, and it immediately put me on high alert. "What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" I asked, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenarios. I was thinking someone was in the hospital, or there had been an accident, or maybe someone had died. Those were the only reasons I could imagine for such an urgent mid-afternoon phone call. "Just come over. We need to talk to you about something important," she replied. But she wouldn't give me any more details, no matter how much I pressed her. She just kept insisting that I needed to come over immediately and that it couldn't wait until after work hours. I tried to get more information about what was happening, but she wouldn't say anything else. She just repeated that I needed to get to their house as soon as possible, and that this was something that needed to be discussed in person. My manager was completely understanding about letting me leave early, especially since it seemed like there was some kind of family emergency that required my immediate attention. The drive to my parents' house felt like it lasted forever, even though it was only about 20 minutes from downtown Miami where my office was located. I kept running through every possible scenario in my head, trying to figure out what could be so urgent and serious that my mom would call me at work and demand I come over immediately. Someone had died. Someone was sick. Maybe my parents were getting divorced. Maybe there was some kind of financial crisis or legal problem. Never in a million years would I have guessed what was actually waiting for me when I arrived. When I pulled into their driveway, I immediately noticed that Blake's car was already there, which struck me as odd since he usually worked until 6 p.m. and it was only around 4:15. The front door was unlocked, so I walked in and called out, "Hello!" as I came through the entryway trying to announce my presence. "In here." My dad's voice came from the living room, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach drop. I walked into the living room, and the scene that greeted me was immediately and obviously wrong. Both of my parents were sitting on the couch looking absolutely grim, like someone had just told them that their house was being foreclosed on, or that they had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Their faces were serious and somber in a way that I had rarely seen before, and it filled me with dread about what I was about to hear. And there, on the opposite couch, was Victoria. She was absolutely losing her mind crying. Not just regular tears, but full-on sobbing with her face red and puffy, like she had been crying for hours. Her whole body was shaking, and she kept wiping her nose with tissues that were scattered around her on the couch. "Sit down," my dad said, pointing to the chair across from all of them. His voice was cold and formal, completely different from how he normally spoke to me. "What's going on?" I asked, looking between all of them and trying to make sense of this bizarre scene. "Is everyone okay?" That's when my mom spoke up, and what she said made my heart start racing. "We need you to explain what happened 2 nights ago." I sat there completely confused, trying to figure out what my mom was talking about. "What do you mean? Nothing happened 2 nights ago. I was home watching TV," I said, genuinely puzzled about why they would be asking me about Wednesday night specifically. Victoria looked up at me with this expression of pure terror and hurt, like I was some kind of monster who had just threatened her entire family. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she was staring at me with this mixture of fear and accusation that made absolutely no sense to me. Through her tears, she started talking, and what came out of her mouth made my blood run completely cold. She claimed that Wednesday night, the exact same night that she had texted me those inappropriate messages, I had actually contacted her first, asking to meet up. According to her fabricated story, I had told her that I needed to discuss something important about work and had convinced her to come over to my apartment around 10:30 p.m. She was painting a picture of me as someone who had lured her to my place under false pretenses. But that was just the beginning of her lies. According to Victoria's completely fictional version of events, when she arrived at my apartment, I seemed different and aggressive compared to how I normally acted at work. She claimed that I had offered her something to drink, and that after she had consumed whatever I supposedly gave her, she started feeling dizzy and confused. She was basically accusing me of drugging her. Then she delivered the knockout punch. She claimed that after she was impaired by whatever I had allegedly put in her drink, I forced myself on her. She said that I wouldn't take no for an answer, and that she was too messed up from the supposed drugs to properly fight back or resist what I was doing to her. She was accusing me of drugging and sexually assaulting her. I sat there listening to this absolute insanity with my mouth hanging open, unable to process what I was hearing. This was the exact same girl who had texted me just 2 nights earlier, confessing her romantic feelings for me and asking me to go out for coffee so we could discuss her attraction to me. Now she was sitting in my parents' living room, crying hysterically and claiming that I had drugged and assaulted her on that very same night. "Are you out of your mind?" I said, probably louder than I should have in my parents' house. "Mom, Dad, you cannot seriously believe this." But the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know about where their loyalties lay. They weren't looking at me like I was their son who was being falsely accused of a horrific crime. They were looking at me like I was a predator who had just been caught red-handed. "Dylan, this is very serious," my dad said in this cold, formal voice that I had never heard him use with me before. It was the voice he might use with a stranger or someone he deeply disapproved of. Victoria came to us because she didn't know what else to do. She was scared and traumatized, and she needed help. I tried desperately to explain about the text messages and what had really happened that night. I told them that she was the one who had initiated contact with me, that she had confessed her feelings for me and asked me out, and that I had rejected her advances because she was dating Blake. I explained that I had told her never to contact me again, and that I had been trying to handle the situation quietly to avoid causing family drama. But every single time I opened my mouth to defend myself, Victoria would start crying even harder and more dramatically. She would sob louder and shake more violently, and my parents would look at me like I was making the situation worse by trying to explain what had actually happened. It was like she was putting on a performance, and my attempts to tell the truth were being framed as me victimizing her all over again. "She's lying," I said, my voice getting more desperate as I realized how bad this looked. "Check my phone, check her phone." She texted me first saying she liked me. I told her no because she's dating Blake. I have the evidence right here. But my mom, who had apparently been reading articles about sexual assault or taking some kind of online course about victim advocacy, responded with, "Victims often blame themselves or misremember details when they're traumatized. It's common for them to think they did something to cause what happened to them." I felt like I was losing my mind. My own mother was using pop psychology against me to justify believing this psychopath over her own son. She was treating me like I was some kind of predator who was trying to manipulate the situation and gaslight his victim. That's when Blake walked in from the kitchen. He must have been listening to the entire conversation from the next room, because the second he laid eyes on me, his face went dark with pure hatred. I had never seen my brother look at me with that kind of raw, violent anger before. It was like he was looking at his worst enemy rather than his own flesh and blood. "You sick piece of shit," he said. And before I could even react or defend myself, he was charging at me with the clear intent to cause serious physical harm. I tried to get up from the chair to defend myself, but Blake was faster and caught me completely off guard. He tackled me with the full force of his body weight, and we both crashed to the floor, knocking over the coffee table in the process. The sound of the table hitting the ground and everything on it scattering across the living room floor was loud and chaotic. But all I could focus on was the fact that my own brother was attacking me. Blake managed to get on top of me and started throwing punches with everything he had. He got me good across the jaw with his first hit, and I felt the impact reverberate through my entire skull. Then he landed a couple of solid shots to my ribs that knocked the wind completely out of me and left me gasping for air. I put my hands up trying to protect my face and vital organs, but he was in full rage mode and wasn't going to stop until he had beaten me to a pulp. Blake is about 25 pounds heavier than me and has always been more into working out and physical fitness, so I was pretty much completely screwed in this fight. He had the advantage of surprise, weight, strength, and pure adrenaline-fueled anger on his side. I was basically just trying to survive and minimize the damage he was inflicting on me. He was screaming things like, "How could you do this to her?" and "You're absolutely disgusting," between punches. His voice was full of pure hatred and disgust, like he genuinely believed he was beating up a rapist rather than his own innocent brother. Every word he shouted was filled with conviction that I was guilty of the horrible crime Victoria had accused me of. My dad finally stepped in and pulled Blake off of me, but not before significant damage had been done. My lip was split open and bleeding. My nose was gushing blood, and I could already feel my left eye starting to swell up. The entire left side of my face felt like it had been hit by a sledgehammer, and my ribs were aching with every breath I took. Blake was still trying to get at me even while my dad was restraining him, calling me every disgusting name in the book and trying to break free so he could continue the beating. He was shouting things like, "Let me go! He deserves worse than this! And I'm going to kill him." My dad was struggling to hold him back because Blake was so amped up on adrenaline and rage. "That's enough!" my mom finally yelled, but she wasn't yelling at Blake for beating the hell out of me. She was yelling at both of us for fighting in her living room and making a scene. She was more concerned about the disruption to her house than she was about the fact that her son had just been physically assaulted based on false accusations. I struggled to my feet, wiping blood from my nose with my sleeve and trying to assess the damage Blake had inflicted. My whole face was throbbing with pain, and I could taste blood in my mouth from my split lip. I looked around at all of them. My parents who had raised me for 23 years, my brother who I had grown up with despite our differences, and this girl who was systematically destroying my life with her lies. Not one of them would even consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I was telling the truth about what had really happened. Not one of them was willing to give me the benefit of the doubt or ask for evidence before condemning me. They had all made up their minds based solely on Victoria's tears and dramatic performance. "Get out," my mom said, and her voice was like ice. There was no warmth, no maternal concern, no hint of the woman who had raised me and supposedly loved me unconditionally. "Get out of this house and don't come back until you're ready to admit what you did and get help." "I didn't do anything," I said, but I could hear how desperate and pathetic my voice sounded. I was standing there with a bloody, beaten face, pleading with my own family to believe me, and they were looking at me like I was some kind of monster. "Get out!" my dad roared, and I had never heard him yell like that before in my entire life. The volume and anger in his voice made it clear that there was no reasoning with any of them, no chance of making them see the truth. So I left. I walked out of that house with a bloody nose, a black eye, and the growing realization that my entire family had just disowned me based on the lies of a woman who had literally texted me 2 days earlier, saying she wanted to cheat on my brother with me. I drove home in a daze, trying to process what had just happened, and how my entire world had been turned upside down in the span of 30 minutes. I sat in my apartment that night, holding ice to my swollen face and trying to figure out what the hell had just happened to my life. I kept thinking that surely they would come to their senses once they had time to calm down and think rationally about the situation. Surely someone would realize how insane and contradictory Victoria's story was. Surely my own parents would want to hear their son's side of the story before condemning him forever. But my phone stayed completely silent. No calls, no texts, no attempts to check on me or get more information. They had made their choice, and that choice was to believe a manipulative liar over their own flesh and blood. I was officially on my own, with no family support and no one to turn to for help. Saturday morning, I woke up looking like I had gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. My left eye was swollen almost completely shut, forming this ugly purple and black mess that made it difficult to see properly. My lip looked like a sausage, swollen, split, and painful to touch. I had these dark purple bruises spreading across my jawline that made me look like I had been in a serious car accident or mugged by a group of thugs. I took some pictures of myself with my phone, thinking that maybe if my parents saw the photographic evidence of how badly Blake had beaten me up, they would feel guilty about what had happened and want to hear my side of the story. I thought that seeing the physical damage might make them realize how out of control the situation had gotten and prompt them to reach out to me. I was wrong about that assumption too. Around noon, my phone started ringing, and I saw it was my Aunt Linda calling. She's my mom's sister, and I figured that maybe my mom had called her for advice about the situation. I was hoping that Linda might be the voice of reason in all of this chaos, someone who would be willing to listen to both sides before making a judgment. "Dylan, what is wrong with you?" she said the moment I answered the phone. Her voice was filled with disgust and disappointment, and I could tell she had already made up her mind about my guilt. "Your mother is absolutely devastated. How could you do something like this to that poor girl?" I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, that Victoria was lying about everything, and that I was the one being victimized by false accusations. But Linda cut me off before I could get more than a few words out. "Don't you dare try to blame the victim," she said with absolute conviction. "That poor girl is traumatized, and you're making it worse by denying what you did to her." She hung up on me before I could say another word in my defense. Then my Uncle Robert called with the same accusatory tone. Then my cousin Jessica called, then my grandmother. It was like a coordinated attack from every member of my extended family. The conversation was identical every single time. They had already heard Victoria's fabricated version of events and had decided that I was guilty without any investigation or consideration of alternative explanations. Nobody wanted to hear my side of the story. Nobody asked for proof or evidence of what had supposedly happened. Nobody questioned why Victoria's story didn't make sense, or why she would come to my family instead of going to the police if she had really been assaulted. They just accepted that their family member was a rapist and moved on with their lives accordingly. By Sunday evening, I had gotten calls from pretty much every relative I had. The ones who didn't call were probably just avoiding me entirely, not wanting to deal with the awkwardness of having an accused rapist in the family. My cousin Kyle was literally the only person who seemed even slightly skeptical about the whole situation. "Dude, this doesn't sound like you at all," he said when he called Sunday night. Kyle had always been cool and level-headed, and we had a good relationship despite the age difference. "I mean, you've always been the responsible one in the family. Why would you throw your life away for something like this?" Kyle was about my age, and we had hung out a lot growing up. He was one of the few family members who had always seen through my parents' obvious favoritism toward Blake and understood that the family dynamics were messed up. He had witnessed firsthand how Blake could do no wrong in my parents' eyes while I was held to impossible standards. "Because I didn't do it," I told him honestly. "She's lying, Kyle. She texted me first, trying to get me to cheat with her on Blake. When I said no and told her to never contact me again, she made up this whole story to destroy me." "Can you prove that? Like, do you still have the text messages?" he asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice that maybe there was evidence to support my claims. I checked my phone and realized with a sinking heart that I had deleted the entire conversation after telling Victoria to never contact me again. At the time, I had just wanted the whole uncomfortable situation to disappear, so I had erased all evidence of her inappropriate advances. It was a stupid move on my part, but I'd been trying to pretend the whole thing had never happened. "I deleted them," I admitted, feeling like an idiot. "I was trying to pretend it never happened and didn't want the messages on my phone." Kyle was quiet for a minute, processing this information. "That's not good, man," he finally said. "Without proof, it's just your word against hers." He was absolutely right, and we both knew it. He said that he personally believed me based on knowing my character. But one person believing you doesn't mean much when the other 20 people in your family think you're a monster who belongs in prison. Monday morning, I dragged myself to work, hoping that things would at least be normal there and that I could find some refuge from the chaos that had consumed my personal life. I had worn sunglasses to try to hide the black eye and the worst of the bruising, but there was no way to completely conceal the damage that Blake had inflicted on my face. My manager took one look at me when I walked into the office and immediately asked what had happened. The concern in her voice was genuine, and for a moment I thought maybe I had found someone who would be sympathetic to my situation. "Family stuff," I said, which was technically true even though it didn't come close to explaining the full scope of what I was dealing with. I made it about 3 hours into the workday before everything went to hell there too. Around 11 a.m., my manager called me into her office. She looked really uncomfortable and wouldn't make direct eye contact with me, which immediately put me on edge. I could tell that whatever she was about to say was going to be bad news. "Dylan, we've received a complaint about you from another employee," she said, clearly struggling with how to handle this conversation. "It's a very serious allegation that involves inappropriate conduct toward a female coworker." My stomach dropped to the floor. I knew exactly what this was about, and I realized that Victoria had taken her lies beyond just my family. She had now brought her false accusations into my workplace, where I had worked hard to build a good reputation and establish myself as a reliable professional employee. "What kind of complaint?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I was hoping against hope that maybe it was something minor or unrelated to the nightmare that had consumed my weekend. "I can't go into all the details, but it involves allegations of sexual misconduct," she said, still avoiding eye contact. "HR has reviewed the situation, and we've decided it's best if you clear out your desk and leave the building today." "Jennifer, you know me," I said, trying to appeal to our working relationship, and the fact that she had always been satisfied with my performance. Do you really think I would do something like that? She finally looked at me, and I could see that she felt genuinely bad about what she was being forced to do. It doesn't matter what I think, Dylan, she said with obvious regret. We have to take these allegations seriously, and we can't have you in the workplace while this is being investigated. I'm sorry. So that was it. 4 years at the company, consistently good performance reviews, never so much as a written warning for anything. And I was being shown the door because Victoria had filed a false report. There was no investigation, no hearing, no chance for me to defend myself or present my side of the story. It was just pack your belongings and get out. The walk to my desk was one of the most humiliating experiences of my entire life. Word had obviously spread throughout the office because people were staring and whispering as I made my way across the floor. Some of my coworkers, who I had considered friends, suddenly found their computer screens very interesting when I walked by, unable or unwilling to make eye contact with me. I grabbed my personal belongings and threw everything into a cardboard box: my coffee mug, some family photos, a few books, and various other items that had made my workspace feel like home. The security guard escorted me out of the building like I was some kind of dangerous criminal. 20 minutes earlier, I had been a valued employee with a promising future. Now I was being treated like a threat to workplace safety. The next few weeks were absolutely the lowest point of my entire life. I applied for probably 60 jobs online, sending out resumes and cover letters to every company that seemed even remotely relevant to my experience and qualifications. I managed to get maybe 10 interviews out of all those applications, and every single one ended the same disappointing way. The potential employers would seem interested at first, asking good questions about my background and experience. Then they would call my references or do a background check, and suddenly the position would be filled by another candidate. I would get those generic rejection emails thanking me for my interest, but informing me that they had decided to go with someone else. News travels fast in our industry, especially when it involves drama like sexual assault allegations. I wasn't officially blacklisted from working anywhere, but I might as well have been. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who had gotten fired from his previous job for supposedly forcing himself on a female coworker. My professional reputation was completely destroyed. My savings account was shrinking at an alarming rate while I struggled to find new employment. I still had all the normal expenses: rent, car payment, student loans, groceries, utilities, but suddenly had no income to cover any of them. I had always been pretty good with money and maintaining a reasonable emergency fund, but I wasn't prepared for sudden, long-term unemployment. I started doing gig work just to bring in some kind of income. DoorDash, Uber, grocery delivery, whatever I could find that didn't require extensive background checks or professional references. It was a far cry from my corporate marketing job, but it was the only way I could keep my head above water financially. The isolation was almost worse than the financial stress. I had always been somewhat of a loner, but now I was completely cut off from everyone I cared about. My family wouldn't talk to me, my former coworkers thought I was a predator, and I had maybe 3 friends outside of work. Even those few friends seemed uncomfortable around me once they heard what had happened, probably wondering if the accusations might be true. I spent most days in my apartment applying for jobs online, sending out resume after resume and writing cover letters that I hoped would somehow convince someone to give me a chance. Most nights I spent driving around the city delivering food to people, which was really depressing, but at least kept me busy and brought in enough money to barely cover my basic expenses. The worst part was the quiet moments when I wasn't actively distracted by work or job searching. Those were the times when I would start thinking about how completely unfair it all was, how one person's malicious lies had destroyed everything I had worked for over the years. I would sit there in my apartment, staring at the walls, wondering how my life had gone from successful and stable to completely ruined in the span of just a few days. Around week 4 of unemployment, I got desperate enough to swallow my pride and call my parents. I wasn't looking for forgiveness or trying to convince them that I was innocent. I had given up on that possibility. I just needed to know if there was any chance of getting my job back if Victoria ever admitted that she had made the whole thing up. My dad answered the phone on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the coldness in his voice the moment he realized it was me calling. "What do you want, Dylan?" he asked, like I was some kind of unwelcome telemarketer rather than his own son. "Dad, I'm not asking you to believe me, but I need to know something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "If it ever came out that Victoria made the whole thing up, would you help me get my job back?" "She didn't make it up," he said with absolute certainty and finality. Stop calling here until you're ready to take responsibility for what you did. He hung up on me without giving me a chance to say anything else. That phone call was when I realized that they weren't just temporarily angry with me or going through some kind of phase. They genuinely believed that I was capable of drugging and forcing myself on someone. My own parents thought I was a predator and a danger to women. That realization hit me harder than any of Blake's punches had. I wasn't just dealing with a temporary family dispute that would eventually blow over. I was completely on my own, with no family support, no job prospects, and a reputation that followed me everywhere I went. At 23 years old, I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch because some psychopath had decided to destroy me for rejecting her advances. But you know what? Sometimes when you lose everything, you find out what you're really made of. After 2 months of delivering food and getting rejected from every decent job I applied for, I realized that the normal route back to professional employment wasn't going to work for me. Not after Victoria had completely wrecked my reputation in the industry. So I took a job at Metro Distribution, a warehouse operation that paid $11 an hour and didn't require background checks or professional references. No questions asked, just show up and work. It was mind-numbing, physically exhausting labor, but it was honest work that paid the bills. I knew I couldn't do warehouse work forever, but it gave me the stability I needed to start planning my next move. After every shift, when I was completely exhausted and just wanted to collapse on my couch, I would force myself to spend hours online teaching myself digital marketing. I studied Facebook ads, copywriting, audience targeting, conversion optimization, all the skills that small businesses needed but didn't know how to do themselves. I figured that if traditional employment wasn't going to work out for me, I would create my own opportunities. 7 months into my warehouse job, I finally landed my first freelance client. It was a small pizza place called Gino's, and the owner was willing to give me a chance because his nephew had recommended me. I ran a $250 Facebook advertising campaign for them that brought in over $1,800 in new business. The owner was so impressed with the results that he started telling other local business owners about what I had accomplished for him. Word began to spread through the local small business community. More restaurants, retail stores, and service businesses started hiring me to run their online advertising campaigns. By month 9, my freelance income was matching what I had been making at the warehouse, so I quit my day job and opened a bare-bones office to launch Summit Digital Marketing. It was rough at first, with some weeks where I barely broke even and others where I did reasonably well. But I stuck with it because I believed in what I was doing and I could see the potential for growth. In year 2, I was earning more money than I had ever made in my corporate job. I hired my first employee, then a second, and eventually outgrew my initial office space. The crazy part was how much I genuinely enjoyed the work. At my old corporate job, I had been just a marketing coordinator analyzing other people's campaigns and implementing strategies that other people had developed. Now, every client's success was directly tied to my own work and creativity. When business owners told me that my advertising campaigns had allowed them to hire new employees or have their best quarter ever, that felt absolutely incredible. By year 3, I had 9 employees working in a real office with conference rooms and proper equipment. I was making more money than I had ever imagined possible, and more importantly, I was building something that was entirely mine. Every success belonged to me, and every failure was something I could learn from and improve upon. The whole time this professional transformation was happening, I kept loose tabs on my family through social media. I would occasionally check their Facebook profiles and Instagram accounts, not because I was looking to reconnect with them, but because I was curious about how their lives were progressing. Blake was still working at his same job at Apex Marketing Solutions, still posting pictures of himself at parties and social events like nothing had ever happened. My parents seemed to be doing fine as well, probably still funding whatever Blake needed and supporting him in the way they always had. None of them had any idea what I was building or how successful I was becoming. They had no clue that the son they had thrown away was now running a thriving business and making more money than any of them had ever seen. And that was exactly how I wanted it to be. I didn't want their approval or recognition. I wanted to prove to myself that I could succeed without them. But around this time, something happened that would change everything and set the stage for the justice I had been waiting for. I was at this networking event downtown, one of those professional mixers where local business owners get together to make connections and share referrals. Honestly, I was feeling pretty bored with the whole scene and was about ready to leave when I noticed this woman across the room who looked just as uninterested as I felt. She was tall, brunette, probably in her early 30s, and had this no-nonsense professional vibe that immediately caught my attention. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she was there for business reasons rather than social ones, and she seemed to be evaluating everyone around her with a critical eye. We ended up talking, and I found out that her name was Sophia. She was a private investigator and forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud cases. She had this fascinating career where she would go in and uncover financial crimes, trace missing money, and build cases against white-collar criminals. We hit it off immediately, talking about business, life experiences, and finding that we had a lot in common despite our different professional backgrounds. About 2 months into dating Sophia, she asked me a question that I had been dreading, but knew would eventually come up. "Why don't you ever mention your family?" she asked one evening when we were having dinner at my apartment. "You talk about work, your friends, your hobbies, but you never say anything about your parents or siblings." I usually just gave people a generic response about how we weren't close and left it at that. But Sophia was persistent and kept pushing for more details. She had this way of asking questions that made it clear she wasn't going to accept vague answers or half-truths. Finally, one night when she wouldn't let the subject drop, I decided to tell her everything. I told her about the false accusation, about getting disowned by my entire family, about losing my job, about having to rebuild my life from nothing. I explained how Victoria had destroyed my reputation and my relationships based on complete lies, and how no one had been willing to believe my side of the story. I laid out the entire nightmare from beginning to end, expecting Sophia to either think I was lying or wonder if maybe some of the accusations were true. Most people, when they hear a story like that, would probably have some doubts or questions. They might wonder why someone would make up such serious allegations, or they might think that maybe there was some truth to the accusations, even if the details were exaggerated. Not Sophia. She listened to the whole story with the analytical mind of someone who had spent years investigating fraud and deception. When I finished telling her everything, she said something that gave me chills. "That girl sounds like a professional liar. I've seen this pattern before in fraud cases. People who make false accusations usually don't just do it once. It's learned behavior." "What do you mean?" I asked, not sure where she was going with this line of thinking. "If she screwed you over this badly, I guarantee she's done it to other people too," Sophia said, with the confidence of someone who had seen similar cases before. "Want me to dig into her background? If there's dirt to find, I'll find it." I wasn't sure at first whether I wanted to go down that road. Part of me just wanted to move on with my life and forget about Victoria and the damage she had caused. But another part of me wanted justice, not just for myself, but for any other guys she might have targeted with her lies. After thinking about it for a few days, I decided to say yes. "Give me 3 weeks," Sophia said with a determined look in her eyes. "If Victoria's got skeletons in her closet, I'll find them." Those 3 weeks felt like they lasted forever. I kept wondering what Sophia was discovering, if anything. Part of me was worried that maybe Victoria really was just some girl who had made one terrible decision in a moment of panic or confusion, and that I was about to waste time and money trying to prove something that wasn't there. But Sophia seemed confident that there was more to the story, and her professional experience gave me hope that maybe the truth would finally come to light. Meanwhile, life was going great in every other aspect. My business kept growing at a steady pace, and I was starting to feel like I had really made it in the entrepreneurial world. I had built something substantial from nothing, and I was finally experiencing the kind of success that I had always dreamed about. But I couldn't fully enjoy all of these achievements because I kept thinking about my family and wondering what they were doing with their lives. It had been almost 4 years since they had thrown me out of their house, and sometimes I would find myself wondering if they ever thought about me. Did they ever question whether they had made the right choice in believing Victoria over their own son? Did they ever wonder how I was doing, or if I was even still alive? These thoughts would creep into my mind during quiet moments, and I would have to push them away to focus on the present. I found out the answer to those questions sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I was in my office reviewing campaign performance reports for several clients when my assistant buzzed me on the intercom. "Dylan, there's a woman here to see you," she said. "She says she's your mother." My heart stopped beating for a moment. I hadn't spoken to my mom in almost 4 years, and suddenly she was showing up at my office unannounced. This couldn't possibly be good news. Whatever had brought her here after all this time was probably going to be complicated and emotionally difficult. "Send her in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional while my mind raced with possibilities about what this unexpected visit could mean. My mom walked into my office looking noticeably older than I remembered. She had more gray hair, deeper lines around her eyes, and this tired expression that suggested she had been dealing with some kind of stress or worry. She was dressed nicely, though, like she was trying to make a good impression or show that she had made an effort for this visit. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds, just staring at me and taking in the sight of her estranged son. I could see her eyes scanning around my office, probably wondering how I had managed to afford all of this professional setup and questioning what I had been doing with my life for the past 4 years. "Hi, Dylan," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and uncertainty. "Mom," I replied. I didn't get up from my desk or make any move to embrace her. "What are you doing here?" She looked around my office more deliberately, taking in the expensive furniture, the professional equipment, the framed certificates on the walls, and all the other indicators that I had been successful in building something significant. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to process this information. "We need to talk," she said after a long pause. "Can we go somewhere private?" I almost laughed out loud at the irony of the situation. After 4 years of complete silence, now she wanted to have a conversation. But I was genuinely curious about what had brought her to my office after all this time, so I agreed to grab coffee at a place down the street from my building. We sat across from each other at a small table, surrounded by the awkward silence that comes from years of estrangement. Neither of us seemed to know how to start this conversation or what exactly we were trying to accomplish. Finally, after several uncomfortable minutes, she spoke up. "Your father and I have been doing some thinking," she began, choosing her words carefully. "We know that things ended badly between us, but family is family. We want to rebuild our relationship with you." I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. After 4 years of treating me like I didn't exist, what had suddenly changed? Why now? Why after all this time were they interested in reconciliation? She seemed to get defensive when I didn't immediately respond with enthusiasm. "Does it matter why? We're here now, trying to make things right," she said. But something about the timing and her whole demeanor felt suspicious to me. Then I remembered something that Kyle had mentioned to me a few months earlier about Blake having some kind of money problems. I decided to test a theory about what might be motivating this sudden family reunion. "How's Blake doing?" I asked, watching her facial expression carefully for any tells or reactions. Her face changed slightly, and I could see that I had hit on something important. "He's going through a rough patch right now. He made some bad investments that didn't work out the way he hoped. But that's not why we're here," she said. But her defensive tone told me that it was exactly why they were here. That was when everything clicked into place for me. They had somehow found out that I was successful and financially stable, and suddenly they wanted to reconcile. Not because they missed me or realized they had made a terrible mistake, but because they needed money to bail Blake out of whatever trouble he had gotten himself into. "What kind of bad investments?" I pressed, wanting to get more details about what was really going on. "Dylan, let's focus on us," she said, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from Blake's problems. "We want you to come to dinner this weekend. Your father really wants to see you." I felt this cold anger building up inside me as the full scope of their manipulation became clear. These people had thrown me away like garbage based on the lies of a manipulative woman. They hadn't contacted me once in 4 years, never checked to see if I was alive or dead, never wondered if they might have made a mistake. And now they wanted to play happy family because their golden boy was in financial trouble, and they needed someone to bail him out. "No," I said simply, standing up from the table. "What do you mean, no?" she asked, clearly not expecting such a direct rejection. "You made your choice 4 years ago," I said, cutting her off before she could continue with whatever manipulation she had planned. "And now, you have to live with the consequences of that choice." I got up to leave, but she grabbed my arm desperately. "Dylan, please! Blake really needs help. He owes some dangerous people money." And there it was. The real reason for this sudden family reunion. It wasn't about love or regret or wanting to make things right. It was about money and desperation. I pulled my arm away from her grip. "That's not my problem," I said firmly. "You chose him over me, remember? Deal with the consequences." I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting there crying. But I wasn't done with this situation yet. When I got back to my office, I immediately called Kyle to get the full story about what was really going on with Blake. I needed to understand the complete picture of why my parents had suddenly decided to reach out to me after 4 years of silence. "Dude, what's really going on with Blake?" I asked him straight up. "My mom just showed up at my office trying to reconcile, and I have a feeling it's all about money." Kyle sighed heavily before responding. "It's bad, man. Really bad. Blake got involved in some cryptocurrency scheme that turned out to be a complete scam. He lost like $35,000 of his own money, which was basically his entire savings account. But that wasn't even the worst part. Plus, he convinced some of his friends to invest their money too, and they're absolutely pissed about losing everything. Then he tried to make all the money back through some day trading scheme he found online, and he lost even more. Kyle continued explaining the full scope of Blake's financial disaster. Apparently, he's in the hole for around $90,000 total. Part of it is credit cards and personal loans from banks, which is manageable even though the interest rates are killing him. But the rest of that debt, that's the kind that doesn't come with late fees or payment plans. It comes with threats and people who don't exactly believe in legal collection methods, if you know what I mean. So Blake had finally managed to destroy his own life through his own stupidity and poor decision-making. And now, my parents wanted me to bail him out of the mess he had created for himself. The irony was absolutely incredible. The golden child who could do no wrong had finally done something so wrong that it threatened his safety. That evening, Sophia called me with an update on her investigation into Victoria's background. "I found something big," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. "Can you come over to my apartment? This is something you need to see in person." I drove to Sophia's place, and when she opened the door, I could see that she had files and documents spread all over her dining room table. There were printouts, timelines, photographs, financial records. It looked like she was investigating a major criminal case rather than just doing background research on one person. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her makeshift command center. "This is going to be a lot to process, and I want to make sure you understand everything I've discovered." She started with Victoria's employment history, which was where things got really interesting. It turns out that Victoria had worked at 4 different companies before joining our firm at Apex Marketing Solutions. Not just the 2 previous jobs that I'd known about from her resume, but 4 completely separate employers over the past 5 years. "Look at this pattern," Sophia said, showing me a detailed timeline she had created. She starts at a company, works there for between 14 and 20 months, then makes an accusation of harassment or assault against a male coworker right around the time that performance reviews or potential layoffs are happening. The pattern was eerily consistent across all 4 previous jobs. The guys get fired immediately, she gets sympathy from management and job security, and then she stays for a few more months before moving on to the next company, Sophia explained. But that wasn't even the most shocking part of what she had discovered. Sophia had found evidence that Victoria was embezzling money from our old company during the entire time she worked there. She had started with small amounts, maybe $200 or $300 here and there, but it had escalated over time to almost $60,000 over the course of 2 years. The sexual assault accusations were her insurance policy, Sophia explained. Every time someone got close to discovering the financial fraud, she would cry harassment and point suspicion at innocent men. It was the perfect distraction technique. Sophia pulled out another folder filled with even more damaging evidence. "Remember how Victoria always seemed to have really nice clothes and went on expensive trips, despite working an entry-level HR job that probably paid around $45,000 a year? It turns out that Victoria was running an adult content business on the side. OnlyFans accounts, escort websites, private cam shows. She was basically operating a prostitution ring and using company equipment to do it. Sophia had found dozens of photos and videos that were clearly taken in our old office building, using company computers and even filming in conference rooms after hours. She was basically running a brothel out of the HR department, Sophia said, pulling out printed screenshots that showed Victoria in compromising positions with company logos visible in the background, using company resources, company time, and company property to run her illegal side business. I sat there staring at all the evidence spread across Sophia's table, feeling this incredible mixture of vindication and rage. This woman hadn't just lied about me to save her own skin. She was a professional criminal who had been destroying innocent men's lives for years to cover up her own crimes. "What do we do with all of this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of what Sophia had uncovered. Sophia smiled, but it wasn't a nice, friendly smile. It was the predatory smile of someone who had cornered their prey and was about to deliver a killing blow. "Now, we destroy her completely." Sophia and I spent the next week putting together what she called the nuclear option. It was like building a legal atomic bomb designed to completely obliterate Victoria's life and ensure that she could never hurt another innocent person again. The evidence was so overwhelming and damning that we knew we could destroy her on multiple fronts simultaneously. "We need to be strategic about this," Sophia explained as we organized all the documentation. "We go to the police first and get the criminal charges filed. Then we hit the civil side. Your old company, the IRS, state licensing boards. By the time we're finished with her, she'll be completely radioactive in every sense of the word." The police detective we met with was an older guy named Detective Rodriguez, who specialized in white-collar crime and had years of experience dealing with fraud cases. He was particularly interested in the pattern of false accusation that Victoria had used across multiple companies, and he immediately understood the scope of what we were dealing with. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen in my career," Detective Rodriguez said as he reviewed all of Sophia's documentation. "She's basically been running a criminal enterprise for years." Within 48 hours, the detective had arrest warrants ready for Victoria on multiple charges. They decided to take her down at work for maximum impact, both to ensure she couldn't flee and to make a public statement about the consequences of this kind of behavior. Sophia and I weren't there to witness Victoria's arrest, but word spread incredibly fast through our old industry network. Apparently, Victoria was in the middle of a meeting with senior management, probably discussing some new policy or reviewing quarterly performance metrics, when 3 detectives walked into the conference room unannounced. According to the people who were there, Victoria tried to play it off at first, asking what this was about and maintaining her innocent act. But when Detective Rodriguez read her the full list of charges, her face went completely white, and she realized that her entire criminal operation had been exposed. The charges were extensive and devastating: embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, tax evasion, and operating an illegal business. The list went on and on, covering years of criminal activity across multiple companies and jurisdictions. They handcuffed her right there in front of her boss and all of her co-workers, treating her like the criminal she actually was. Someone in the meeting had the presence of mind to film the arrest on their phone, and the video was all over social media within hours. Victoria's shocked face and the sound of her crying as they led her away in handcuffs became a viral sensation in our local business community. Victoria wasn't just fired from her job, she got completely nuked from orbit. After she was arrested and the full scope of her crimes became public knowledge, the company launched their own internal investigation to determine the extent of the damage she had caused. What they uncovered was even worse than what Sophia had initially discovered. Victoria had been selling confidential client information to competitors, faking HR records to cover her criminal tracks, and using company credit cards for personal expenses. The total financial damage to the company was estimated at around $230,000, not including the cost of the investigation and legal fees. Then the IRS got involved and absolutely slammed her with 6 figures in back taxes and penalties from her unreported income from the illegal adult content business. She had been making substantial money from her side hustle, but hadn't been paying any taxes on it, which is something the federal government takes very seriously. Financially and legally, Victoria was completely toast. The state licensing board revoked her HR certifications permanently, which meant she would never be able to work in human resources again, anywhere in the country. Her professional reputation was completely destroyed, and she would never be able to get a decent job in any field that required background checks or professional references. Within 2 weeks of her arrest, Victoria's entire life had completely imploded. She lost her job, her professional certifications, and her apartment when the news broke and her landlord found out about the criminal charges. She had to move back in with her parents while facing multiple felony charges that could result in years in prison. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for about a month later, and Sophia and I showed up to watch this woman who had destroyed my life finally face real consequences for her actions. Victoria looked absolutely terrible, pale, thin, and clearly stressed out by the legal proceedings she was facing. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was actually the real victim in all of this, claiming that this was some kind of conspiracy against her because she had reported sexual assault. But the evidence against her was so overwhelming and well documented that there was really no viable defense strategy. Multiple victims from different companies, clear financial records showing the embezzlement, video evidence of her illegal activities. The prosecution had built an airtight case that left no room for doubt about her guilt. Victoria ended up taking a plea deal, rather than risk going to trial and potentially facing even harsher sentences. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, plus full restitution to everyone she had stolen from. Her criminal record was permanently destroyed, and she would never be able to work in any professional capacity again. But here's the thing that really shocked me. Even after all of this evidence came out, and Victoria's crimes were exposed to the entire world, my family still didn't reach out to apologize or acknowledge that they had been wrong about me. I figured that once the news broke and everyone in our community knew the truth about Victoria's criminal activities, I would get some kind of acknowledgement from my family that they had been completely wrong about me. I thought that surely they would feel guilty about how they had treated me and would want to make amends for the terrible mistake they had made. But there was nothing. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts to reach out and apologize. It was like they were pretending that the whole situation had never happened, or maybe they were too embarrassed and proud to admit that they had been so thoroughly manipulated by a criminal. It wasn't until 3 months after Victoria's conviction that my family finally showed up at my house. I was at home on a Saturday morning, enjoying a quiet weekend and catching up on some reading, when I heard the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. I looked out the window and saw both of my parents plus Blake getting out of 2 different vehicles. I almost didn't answer the door because I wasn't sure I was ready to deal with whatever drama they were about to bring into my life. But I was genuinely curious about what they would have to say now that the truth about Victoria was public knowledge and undeniable. My dad spoke first when I opened the door, and his tone was somewhat apologetic but also defensive. "Dylan, we owe you an apology. We saw the news about Victoria and we realized that we made a terrible mistake." "Mistake?" I said, letting that word hang in the air between us. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a deliberate choice. You chose to believe her over me without asking a single question, or considering that maybe your own son was telling the truth." My mom was crying again, just like she had been that day 4 years ago when she had kicked me out of their house. "We're sorry, Dylan. We should have trusted you. We want to make this right and rebuild our relationship." Blake stepped forward, looking like he had aged 10 years since the last time I had seen him. The stress of his financial problems and the guilt of what he had done to me was clearly taking a toll on his physical and mental health. "Bro, I can't believe what I did to you," he said, his voice filled with what seemed like genuine remorse. "I beat you up for defending yourself against a criminal. I've been carrying this guilt around for years, and it's been eating me alive." "Have you, though?" I asked, cutting straight through his emotional manipulation. "Because none of you contacted me when you found out the truth 3 months ago. You're only here now because you need something from me." Their faces told me that I was absolutely right about their motivations. This wasn't about apologizing or family reconciliation or making things right. This was about Blake's debt problems and the fact that they had somehow found out about my financial success. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, making my position crystal clear. "You're going to leave my property and never come back. You're going to tell everyone that I don't exist. If you're at a family gathering and someone asks about me, you're going to say that you only have one son." "Dylan, please," my mom begged, trying to appeal to whatever family loyalty might still exist. "We're family. That has to count for something." Blake tried to play the brother card, appealing to our shared history and blood relationship. "Come on, man. I know I messed up badly, but we're still brothers. Blood is thicker than water, right?" I started walking back toward my house, done with this conversation, and ready to close the door on this chapter of my life permanently. I stopped and turned around for one final statement. "You had your chance to be my family 4 years ago when I needed you most," I said. "You chose to believe a criminal over your own son. You chose to throw me away like garbage based on lies. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." I slammed the door and watched through the window as they stood there for a few minutes, probably hoping I would change my mind and come back out. But eventually they realized that I was serious about cutting them out of my life permanently, and they finally left. That confrontation happened 8 months ago, and I haven't heard from any of them since. My business is doing better than ever, with new clients and expansion opportunities that I never could have imagined when I was starting out. Sophia and I are engaged and planning our wedding, and I've never been happier or more fulfilled in my personal life. As for my parents and Blake, the last I heard through Kyle, they ended up having to sell their house to pay off some of Blake's debts to the dangerous people he owed money to. My dad had to come out of retirement and take a job he hates, and my mom had to get a part-time job to help make ends meet. Blake is living in their basement at 27 years old, working at some dead-end retail job because his reputation in the professional world is completely shot. They made their choice when they decided to believe a criminal over their own son. Now they get to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of their lives, just like I had to live with the consequences of their betrayal for 4 years. The difference is that I used those consequences as motivation to build something better, while they're just wallowing in the misery they created for themselves. And honestly, I couldn't be happier with how everything turned out.